Let us begin. Welcome, everyone, to this Mass Peace Action webinar. War is not justified by party politics. Interesting topic. Wasn't too long ago when the peace movement and many people in the Democratic Party would make their assessment of what their position is on wars based on rational and moral assessment of the situation. But these days, it seems like other factors are influencing how people relate to wars and whether they oppose them or not. Tonight's speaker will be Harris Grumman. Many of you know Harris. He's active in so many different fields on so many different issues. First of all, he's the executive director of the Service Employees International Union, Massachusetts State Council. And in that position, he's led campaigns to win rights for childcare providers, rideshare drivers, and other important issues that have helped Massachusetts, for all our problems, have some pretty darn good policies in some areas. But in 2013, he founded and has since helped lead the Raise Up Massachusetts Coalition, which many of you are probably familiar with. This coalition of faith community, labor, community organizations has nearly doubled the minimum wage in Massachusetts to $15 an hour. It's created the most extensive paid family and medical leave program in the United States. And as many of you may recall, recently passed the millionaire's tax. And it's good they did, because we are going to have problems with funding. But the fact that our public schools get as much funding as they do, and as the subway systems are getting resources that make it possible to improve them, which I think we can see some improvements recently anyway. We can thank all the efforts of that coalition, the Raise Up Massachusetts Coalition, for really plugging away and working so hard. Many of us worked on it with them, of course, but they were the core coalition that really pushed this, raising tremendous amounts of revenue for our public schools and for public transit and a few other related issues. So the last thing I'll mention is that last year, we were very lucky at Mass Peace Action to have Harris joining our board of directors, so that he is now going to be helping to guide Mass Peace Action into the future and help us deal with this very difficult and confusing situation that we face right now. So Harris, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for all the work you've done for all of us and for the state. And let's see what you have to say on this topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Glad to be here. I've done a lot of hosting of these webinars, so it's kind of nice to be hosted for a change. But, I would like to, bring up some topics that I think have become very serious for us to reflect on because of what's happened in the past 3 years. A very hard time for peace activism and a very disorienting time for it. When I was growing up, I remember my dad about every year or so would look up from his New York Times, which was always in his hands, and say, "It's strange, but ever since World War II, no year has gone by where we're not at war with somebody." And as the decades went on, he kept saying that about every year or so. And I finally really understand what he was driving at. He had a very ironic look on his face when he was saying that. And so that's sort of a starting off point, I think, for what I want to cover. And we will have questions and answers afterwards. So let's see. I'm going to share my screen and talk to you about history first. I mean, there's a history of war. A lot of us on this call, I'm sure, came of age actually in a time of what we sort of think of as the Reagan to George Bush, the second wars. And that does give this very partisan sort of sense of war, like it's some kind of a Republican pathology. So let's just look at that a minute. I mean, we do have, a problem with that. Let me just, I think I need to reload this. Okay. Yes, history. In our general sense of history, Republican wars are bad. And I mean, just to remind us, this is not a comprehensive list, but this is a comprehensive enough list about wars of the past, back to World War II. Eisenhower, he did a major buildup of nuclear deterrence. I mean, our whole idea of, ability to destroy the whole world comes from his administration's buildup and the counter buildup in the Soviet Union. He overthrew Mossadegh in Iran. He overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala. He overthrew Lumumba in Congo. And I think I can say with certainly all of those we're still paying for today, those actions. Nixon, bombing of North Vietnam, carpet bombing of North Vietnam, intense bombing of Cambodia and Laos, the overthrow of Allende in Chile, Reagan, the Contra War in Nicaragua, the invasion of Grenada, the intervention in Lebanon, George Bush I, invasion of Panama, the first Iraq War, George Bush II, the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, and then the invasion of Iraq, and the expansion of NATO into the former Soviet Union republics, like Ukraine and Georgia. That was led by him to push that, something I've become painfully aware of more recently. And then Trump won, strong support for Israeli expansionism, and very hostile actions against Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, a real assertion of American imperialism over this hemisphere again. Okay, well, we look at that and we say, well, that's them doing their thing, and it's why we are always protesting them. But I have to go to the other side. Are Democrat wars good? So let's review. Truman, atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, first thing he really did after Franklin Roosevelt died. The Truman Doctrine, which started with military aid to Greece and Turkey, and which launched the Cold War that lasted until basically 1990. The Korean War, one of the most devastating wars of the century. Kennedy, often seen as a kind of hero of the counterculture and so on. Intervention in Laos, Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuba, nuclear standoffs over Vienna and Berlin that almost led to nuclear war in each case. Cuban Missile Crisis, which came the closest to nuclear war we've seen until most recently. And the escalation in Vietnam that became unstoppable. Johnson comes in, invasion of the Dominican Republic, backed the coup and mass murders in Indonesia, 1 million people killed. And of course, major escalation in Vietnam. Carter, we just praised him and for, fairly good reason. And yet even Carter, proxy war with Russia in Afghanistan, that's where we, generated people like Osama bin Laden as our agents there. support for Indonesia during its invasion of East Timor, and some other more minor things. Clinton, NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, violating the promise to Gorbachev that we would not expand NATO. Bombing of Iraq, bombing of Serbia. Obama, who won a Nobel Peace Prize. Ongoing war in Afghanistan, not wound down. Intervention in Syria, and the invasion of Libya, which has left that country a shambles. And then Biden, proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, Cold War with China over the South China Sea and Taiwan, and proxy war with Iran, which includes the Houthis, Gaza, the Lebanon business. I mean, all of it. And, you know, really a regional war from an American point of view. So why are we simply party loyalists when it comes to war? Because when these things happen, we tend to say the Democrats are right when they do these things, but the Republicans are wrong when they do them. And I think the answer lies in understanding the federal budget as a whole. That's where you get the perspective that explains a lot of this. So let me do a little sort of, I went from history, now I'm going to do a little geography. The governmental sphere, this is a sort of power map of federal policy, very simplified, but it gets at the big things and the big things that are facing us right now under the new Trump administration. The governmental sphere. In the governmental sphere, I like to say there are 3 M's. What you need to know about the federal budget can be summarized in 3 M's. And one of those is millionaires. And millionaires, why millionaires? Because at the federal level, we have a progressive tax system, a progressive income tax that has changed dramatically over time and become much less progressive, but is still a truly progressive income tax. And that means that a very large proportion of money going into the federal budget that is paid for by the income tax is coming from millionaires. And that's a very important thing, because without that, the rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer forever. But with that, you actually can at least regulate that, or maybe even improve it, as we did in the mid-century, last century. The other 2 M's are Medicaid and the military, because there are 2 huge buckets that money from the progressive income tax goes into. One of them is Medicaid, which is a health program, but it's a health program paid for by people, by the income tax, and not by people paying payroll taxes at a much flatter level. This is really helping redistribute money, because it's allowing people to get care who couldn't afford it, and by getting it from a progressive tax. And in fact, that's a very important thing to understand about Medicaid. It covers 80 million people now in the United States, and it covers 90% of all long-term care. Now, money comes from the millionaires to that. Money from millionaires then goes in the other pile, which is the military, which is also paid for from the progressive income tax. Now, these 2 things, Medicaid and the military, are 2 radically different philosophies of government, what government's main purpose is. The old Hobbesian idea of, like, the jungle out there, and that government's only real purpose is a monopoly on violence to keep order, military, police, and so on, is captured by our huge investments in the military. The other, Medicaid, is the welfare state, or the welfare for all, that came into prominence in the 20th century in Western countries and across the world, where the government's purpose is actually to take care of people and to make their lives better. So those are 2 radically different things. Now, the economic sphere outside the government is a whole bunch of things. And you'll see I'm sort of doing a mood ring thing here, where we're using colors and also which side of the chart they're on. You have, like, over on one side, tourism, biomedical, consumer products. These are, fairly non-aggressive things. They're not too good for the climate, but they're not violent. Big tech kind of in the middle. And then you go up the other side, heavy industry, energy, arms, and you're getting more and more into what does lead to violent struggles. And that's really, that economic sphere is feeding the millionaires. The millionaires would not exist without the profits from all these economic pursuits. And so that feeds up into the millionaires. So this is where the problem sort of comes. And of course, you can see now there's a kind of split between the two sides, peace and war. The problem is when you're thinking about, cutting something, like if you want to cut the budget and you cut the military is actually one of the things that relies heavily on the economic sphere, on the arms, energy, and heavy industry, and more big tech. And those things, if you cut the military, you cut those economic engines. And when you cut those economic engines, you cut the profits to those millionaires. And this is the feedback loop that creates the cycle I'm going to then show right now, which is that generally, what's different about Republicans and Democrats, very generally, not on a lot of specifics, but generally, Republicans cut taxes for millionaires. These are the old billionaires for Bush out protesting that they need tax cuts. They also cut Medicaid to pay for those tax cuts. And they would like to cut it almost altogether if they could. And that's where we are right now, actually. And there are people trying to protest cuts to the healthcare they need. And finally, they maintain or increase funds for the military. Okay, so that all makes sense because they're trying to save money on Medicaid to cut taxes for the millionaires, but not hurt their investments in the military, which they need to make profits. So, that's a very coherent philosophy. The Democrats, on the other hand, generally, again, maintain or increase taxes on millionaires. I mean, Bill Clinton came in and reversed a lot of Reagan tax cuts. Obama did too. Biden also did some progressive tax work. They almost always do something to raise taxes on millionaires. They also do their best to maintain at least or increase funding for Medicaid because, they do believe in that philosophy of government. However, they also maintain or increase funding for the military. We've never had a peace dividend. We've never stopped having a total war economy. So we prefer the Democratic scenario over the Republican one as progressives generally. Yet we would much prefer I would anyway, but I think most of us would much prefer to tax millionaires and fund Medicaid with it, not fund the military. So in other words, if we did that, we would have a system where from each according to their ability to pay taxes, to each according to their need for care, an extremely humane society. So the question is, even if we vote for the lesser of two evils, because we have the Democratic scenario as better, why do we feel we need to support the full program of that lesser evil? And this is where I think we've really ended up in a terrible moral bind. And I'll use the labor movement as an example. Here's a thumbnail history of the labor movement and war. Okay. Before the Second World War, the general tendency of the labor movement was anti-war. I mean, here's Eugene Debs, let the capitalists do their own fighting and furnish their own corpses, and there will never be another war on the face of the earth. And of course, the slogan that was very common then was, why should the poor fight a rich man's war? So that sort of sums up that whole chart I showed before. But during the Cold War and sort of coming off of World War II and the mobilization of labor, organized labor, for the war effort, organized labor became deeply embedded in a total war economy. And really, the strength of the labor movement was that you had good jobs in military production, and that made the labor movement extremely cooperative with the military side of our government. And that went under the slogan, guns and butter. In other words, if you want butter, you have to build guns. Now, we're in a very different time right now, and I don't think people have completely come to grips with that. Since the 1970s, labor has shifted dramatically into public health and human service work. Teachers. The teachers were in for a long time, but now we have a huge growth. Home care workers, child care workers, hospital workers, mental health workers, substance use workers. They're all more and more unionized and more a gigantic proportion of our labor movement. So labor should be ready to return to its anti-war roots. And yet it has not. The last 3 years, I think, are a glaring example of this. And, we've had basically a new Cold War launched under Joe Biden. And this is a very interesting thing because, he started out his presidency with the backing of my union very strongly, and for good reason. He was going to do Build Back Better. And that was all about funding Medicaid, $500 billion in new Medicaid funding. Sounds kind of quaint now, like a small amount of money after what we've heard from the Republican Congress, the last week. But it's still, that was a significant shift into Medicaid. And it was going to be paid for by progressive taxes on multinational corporations and restoring tax rates. And it was that program that we were looking for. And if he wasn't cutting the military, at least he was doing the other side, rebalancing things. Okay. That failed because of 2 votes in the Senate. And I have to say, that is not a good sign if a president cannot get even half a loaf after just 2 votes in the Senate. I mean, Lyndon Johnson, when he was doing the Civil Rights Bill, knew how to get around that. FDR got around much worse than that. It was a failure. And I don't fully understand how he let it stand as a failure. But what he did do was turn to a new Cold War, which I call the Biden Doctrine, with Russia, China, and Iran. That's a world war of a Cold War right there. And what's most disturbing is that how the main progressive causes, the environment, the peace movement, and the labor movement responded to this. The environmental movement, silent. There was almost no resistance at all to these 3 Cold Wars. And then this is really a grotesque situation because these 3 wars have taken, before Trump even, have taken the climate agenda off the agenda. I mean, during that time, while we were doing subsidies to industry and so on, much, ballyhooed Inflation Reduction Act stuff about electric vehicles and other quasi, impact things, we became the biggest supplier of natural gas in the world. And that was built on the sanctions against Russia. And our fracking went through the roof, and we got Europe off Russian fossil fuels and onto our fossil fuels. So, how the environmental movement could be silent during all that about those wars is amazing. Okay, the peace movement, that's us right here, MAPA and everything, Mass Peace Action, divided. I've been shocked how many people have stood for arming Ukraine, for even having a bellicose position toward China, and sometimes even a bellicose position toward Iran, especially if they are, people who are also very pro-Israel. And that's been really rough because it means that I've heard people say things that I just don't understand how a peace activist can call for more arms to get to peace. I mean, peace through strength has always been our nemesis for the past 80 years. The labor movement. Well, there it's been my party, right or wrong. If Joe Biden says it's good, if Kamala Harris wants the most lethal military in the world, well, then we want that. Now, we did protest the Gaza situation somewhat, and that was a very worthy thing to protest, a terrible moral thing. But again, it was so targeted, and it really felt more like a protest of Israel than a protest of the United States' role in that. Because to understand the United States' role in that, I would argue you have to understand the United States' geopolitical war with Iran. And that you didn't hear much about. Nobody took a stand on that. So our 3 big movements did that, and now we're wandering in the wilderness. We're hopefully not going to spend 40 years or whatever in the desert. But as we wander in the wilderness, it's really time that we return to some core principles before we move forward. And those are peace principles, because that's really where we failed. I mean, we need to fight the fight on Medicaid, not tax cuts for the rich. That's the fight we'll be fighting. But we have to do an internal reevaluation of some basic values, which is there is no such thing as a good war. People might want to take issue with that, but I absolutely will stand by that. Diplomacy before war, always. And in fact, the democratic wars that I listed, almost every one of them was a failure of diplomacy or even an unwillingness. JFK was notorious for this, and so was Joe Biden. Refusal to engage in diplomacy until things had reached extremely dire situations. And never elevate party politics above opposition to war again. I beg of you all. So that is my message for tonight. Thank you very much. You're muted, Paul.
Thank you, Harris, for laying out that so clearly. We are going to take questions and comments, quick ones, in just a minute. And to do that, we're going to ask people to use the react button at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand. And we'll do our best to work through people raising their hands. You'll be unmuted when you're called upon to ask your question. And we'll see what we can get through. But just before we begin that, we're going to call on Cole Harrison to put up an alert. There's all kinds of stuff going on in Congress right now and in the administration in terms of funding, more weapons being sent to Israel, giant bulldozers being sent to Israel to knock down Palestinian homes in the West Bank. Every hideous weapon you can imagine, more 2,000-pound bombs. The Trump administration is on the verge of sending all of that. And we're trying to at least raise symbolic resistance to that hopefully can be built on over time. In addition, there's an effort to get the United States to start providing help, finances to UNRWA. Remember, the U.S. has cut off UNRWA funding, and this is having a very bad effect on Palestinians in Gaza as they try to survive. Cole, do you want to kind of explain what's being asked for people to sign on to here?
Yeah, so it's several arms shipments to Israel, as you know, all through the Biden administration, all through the last 16 months of genocide in Gaza. We have Biden administration was shipping arms to Israel. There was a vote on that in the Senate that Bernie Sanders forced back in November. We got 19 Democratic senators to vote no on some of those arms. Not nearly enough to win in the Senate, but enough to have a credible faction in Congress that was against those arms. So now, you know, a little bit in the spirit of Harris's talk, we hope it is plausible that a greater number of Democrats would now support blocking those arms because they're being sent by a Republican president. Actually, we wrote this on Friday. There were 4 different arms shipments scheduled then. Now 3 more have been sent this week, or sent to Congress, I should say. And so this is a developing situation. We also have we have a counterpart resolution in the House filed by Rashida Tlaib and others just yesterday to block some of those weapons. So there's now 7 different arms shipments, and we don't know how many of those 7 will come to a vote, but some of them probably will. So right now we're trying to get senators and members of Congress to sign on and support those bills. And secondly, the UNRWA, which is the UN Refugee Relief Works Agency, that pretty much runs all the humanitarian aid as well as the educational programs in Gaza, the health programs, that was cut off by Congress and by the Biden administration a year ago. U.S. used to be the largest funder of it. It now sends nothing to it. And so this is a bill to restore that funding. And it was filed in the last Congress, got a significant number of Democratic support. did not pass, but it has a meaningful support and has been refiled, or rather is going to be refiled. We have to get more members of Congress to support that before it can be credibly refiled. So this is an action that sends message to your two senators and also to your House rep about these two issues.
Okay, well, that's
Put
great,
the
Cole.
link in
Could
the
you, could you,
chat.
yeah,
Yeah.
could you put a link to that message in the chat so people can just click on the link,
Yep, there it is.
fill out the form right there to send this message to your two senators and to your representative in the House. If you could just take 30 seconds, 45 seconds maybe, to just fill that out, if you agree with it, of course, and those messages will automatically be sent specifically to your representative in Congress as well as to the two senators. So let's just take 30 seconds more. Please go to the chat, open the link, and if you agree with this petition, please sign it now. Thank you. And then we'll come back in just 30 seconds for questions and further comments from Harris.
While you're working on that, I'll just mention that we will have a lobby day in Congress, or lobby week, the first week of April, the first full week of April. MAPA will be going down as well as other states from Peace Action. So join us there. Be in touch if you'd like to join us in Washington for face-to-face lobbying in Congress.
Yeah, so that would be, if you haven't done that yet, especially, it'd be a very interesting experience to go and visit the offices of your representatives and senators and see what that's like, and kind of dip your toe into that whole process that's so important. So let's go to some questions. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to sign, to add your name and other information to that petition if you agree with it. Please continue to do that, and let's take a question from Abby Yano. Abby? There we go. Oh. You're muted right now, Abby. Do you see it?
Well, you were unmuted by the host, and then you remuted yourself accidentally, so it won't go off. Mm-hmm.
Mary Ellen or Cole, can we unmute Abby again? Oops, it keeps flashing off and then right back on again.
All right.
Okay, there I am.
Got it now.
There I am. Hi, Harris. Question for you. You said something about at the Cold War, after the Cold War, that I think you said something like the manufacturing or the workers were working in the military industries. As I wondered what they were working in prior to the Cold War, and why didn't that continue? That maybe it was manufacturing or something.
No, I think you misunderstood what I said. I meant during the Cold War, they worked for the military. It actually, by the time the Cold War ended, the military production had declined a lot in this country, as had all manufacturing through globalization, by exporting a lot of that stuff out of the country. And the end of the Cold War should have kind of, moved a big amount of the economy from military production that was still going on to civilian production. We had a whole project back then called Jobs for Peace. And we were always very upset that there was really no peace dividend from the end of the Cold War. We just kept on funding the military as before. But by then, the labor movement had declined in that sector so much. It was really the 70s saw the decline of that, and that's what led to the labor movement becoming, like my union, predominantly care workers and service workers, and not manufacturing or military manufacturing. So sorry.
But I think Abby's question was, what did the industrial production consist of before World War II?
Yes, that's
Oh,
exactly
before
right.
World War II. Oh, okay. I'm saying, well, before World War II, it was mostly civilian production. We had a very small military before World War II. I mean, almost laughably small. I mean, if you go back and look at photos from 1939, even, the little, wooden biplanes and stuff on the ships, and everything was very, we had a philosophy in this country up until World War II of not being a total war economy. That was considered actually a dangerous idea and also just a waste of money. And so what most people were doing was auto manufacturing, steel, all these things for making buildings, for, consumer products. I mean, there's some really amazing advertising in National Geographics from the 1930s. I really recommend going back and looking at it, which is a kind of not guns and butter, but it's more like cars and butter. There's a beautiful photo of a piece of toast with a lot of butter and jam on it. And you're like, what are they advertising? They're advertising automobiles. They're saying because of automobiles, workers have this toast with butter and jam. And it's really like guns and butter, right? But it's before the guns. So, and that was the big growth era of the labor movement was the 30s, because Roosevelt favored the labor movement, created the National Labor Relations Act, and we quadrupled the number of workers in unions in the industrial sector. And that's why, our sort of traditional image of a worker is somebody on the assembly line in a General Motors plant or something like that. In the war, all that got flipped over to military production, but they, again, Roosevelt maintained the labor laws and the force of the labor movement in that military production, with the idea, at least I believe in Roosevelt's mind, that after the war, they would go back into civilian production. Instead, after the war, they maintained the total war economy of World War II into perpetuity. In fact, I mean, we still have it today. The difference is it's not a bastion of organized labor anymore.
Harris, who was it who pushed at the end of World War II to maintain and grow the military economy?
Well, that was predominantly the Democrats, because Truman he restarted basically a world war around the Cold War with his Truman Doctrine, which, it's a very good book on that. Richard Freeland's book. It's called The Truman Doctrine and the Origins of McCarthyism. I mean, he's a strong Democrat, Dr. Freeland. I mean, I've talked to him before, and a liberal, but he really sees the origins of our worst side coming out of that. And it was a desperate attempt in some ways by Truman to win over the Republicans to his administration, because they were very anti-communist. So they were isolationist and anti-communist. He was, you could say sort of imperialist and not particularly anti-communist, but that was the way he justified imperialist, hegemony in Europe, in Asia, was by doing that. So that maintained a total war economy. And then Eisenhower also did. Somebody put a comment in like, but didn't Eisenhower make that speech at the end of his, the beware the military industrial complex? He knew wherever he spoke. I mean, he was one of the architects of the military industrial complex. I mean, this is the problem with all these folks. They're not evil or stupid. They know what's wrong, but they are absolutely entrapped in that way, that modus operandi.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Harris. Thanks, Abby. Let's go to Daniel Shea.
Now, let me I just make sure I got that my audio on. Yeah, one of the things I'm really glad to hear you speak. One of the things that I'm involved in right now, and you should know about, is that I'm on the Veterans for Peace National Labor Working Group. And so we have I don't know if you can see that. I don't know if that's going to work out. We have a card that we've been putting out. I've been at a number of strikes by, the nurses strike, the Starbucks strikes, Amazon strikes, all of these various strikes, which seems to be a real movement in the service industry that's really coming out and fighting against it. When you're talking about, I see, that we need labor and veterans coming together. The postal office under major problem is I've been out there online with them speaking about the idea that the Postal Service is one of the largest employers of veterans and of minorities. And when they start cutting these things and going into privatization, we're facing with this DIU, whatever it is, diversity issues that are trying to stop so-called woke. And the Veterans Administration is under attack. And so I work very closely with the American Federation of Government Employees. All of them are in the battle here fighting against this and looking at how veterans and war and what that means for our economy. We're calling for $100 billion out of the military budget to go back into human needs that we need for healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera. So we are trying to do that right now. And that's, I think I wanted you to know that we're doing that. I'm also really concerned with this whole thing of the Trump administration actually sending immigrants to Guantanamo. And I'll be doing vigils actually starting tomorrow on trying to stop that and calling upon our Latino community. We're talking about jobs, and labor unions in the past have been strong advocates for immigrants in this country and what they do. And, I've worked with the Farm Workers Union in the past and here in Oregon. So I'd like to hear more about those kinds of things how we're dealing with that, and what you see the positive things that are happening with labor unions coming out and actually fighting right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think right now the agenda is a unifying one and very clear on a couple of those issues you mentioned. I mean, the top two priorities of SEIU, for example, are fighting the Medicaid cuts for tax cuts for the rich and fighting back for immigrant rights. And that's for the reason you said. I mean, actually, our membership is about, I'd say in Massachusetts, is about 30-40% immigrants. And, some of those people also have temporary status or some kind of weak status that they could get deported for. And, we did work, like I was the lead, lobbyist on the driver's license for immigrants that we passed in Massachusetts 2 years ago. So, I mean, these are very important issues to us as a labor union. Now, the whole labor movement isn't evenly understanding that, but in the areas you're talking about, I mean, think about it. I mean, economically, we could not have the care industry we have, nor can we shore up the care industry that's suffering right now, or the service industries, like you mentioned, like Starbucks and Amazon, if we didn't have immigrant workers here. I mean, we would be in a desperate situation, and agriculture is even worse, like the farm workers, as you said. So, I mean, these are causes we can fight for, and I think there's a lot of unity to fight for them, but we have to fight for them in a smart way. We have to really, I think the point about veterans is very important. I mean, in certain periods of history, we had I always admire the Veterans for Peace. I know you very well. But we also had the Vietnam veterans against the war. Many of my dearest colleagues when I was young were out of that movement, and then we have famous things like Coxey's Army and, many protests by, veterans, like some of the ones who joined the labor movement and the IWW back in the 1920s after World War I, some of whom were murdered by by company thugs, usually in brutal ways because, they were a danger. Because to have a veteran get up and say workers deserve a fair wage and everything is a very powerful statement. So yeah, I think that's great. Let's keep let's keep the veterans in the center of our movement. We have a lot of veterans in SEIU. So yeah, thank you for that. That's very important stuff. But are you not descended from the Daniel Shea? I wonder. I mean, we used to dress up as Daniel Shea's regulars to protest things. The old rebels from after the American Revolution who fought for the veterans of the Revolutionary War who were ending up in debtor's prison and being treated terribly back in the 1780s.
Yeah, well, I think Daniel probably doesn't go back quite that far, but it sounds like he's very much in that tradition. Thanks very much, Daniel. Thanks for all your work on those things.
State,
I mean, maybe at some point, I want to get to the next questions, but at some point it'd be interesting to see all these movements that are gathering. Is peace a part of that agenda? That's the question that we're trying to raise tonight, right? So let's get on to how about Donald Smith? Donald, do you have a question?
Yes, my question is, right now it appears that the Republicans are sort of positioning themselves as being anti-war. It might be for the wrong reasons, but they become the peace party, and it makes it difficult for the peace movement to to support ending the war in Ukraine, because it looks like we're allying with Trump, and the propaganda on like social media now is overwhelming, saying I stand with Ukraine. And I mean, I don't like Putin, but it is true that the U.S. provoked it. I mean, and so anyway, I want you to comment on the political dynamic, the domestic, how the peace movement interacts with with Trumpism and with the domestic politics between Democrats and Republicans, please. Thanks.
Yes, well, no, and this is exactly the point. I mean, this party politics problem cuts both ways. So when Biden was president, if he was doing something that at least you and I didn't like pushing NATO onto the borders of Russia and provoking a war there, and not negotiating something to stop that war, most people I knew were saying, well, it must be good, because if Joe Biden, if the Democrats won it, then they must be they're our equivalent. Then the Ukrainians become the proxies of the Democratic Party, not just the proxies of the United States. And now with Trump doing the opposite, the danger is people will say, well, then this proves that Trump and Putin are in league together against the Democrats, meaning the Democrats, both in the sense of like international democracy and, so it creates this whole Manichaean thing. And this is really a tool that's used all the time by both sides to create, to justify war. You can only justify war by eliminating the gray areas, and everything is black and white. They're evil, we're good. They're Hitler, we're, I don't know, just defending democracy and, wonderful things. And so you always do that. I mean, you always create this Manichaean situation. And so that spills over then into this, where, Trump is winding down the war in Ukraine in favor of re-establishing relations with Russia, which, given that we're the two biggest nuclear powers in the world, if we had good relations of any kind and were able to negotiate arms control, environmental stuff, or anything, would be like a utopia, except that, Trump doesn't support all those things. In other words, we're back in the same problem where Trump is going to wind down this war in order to start another war, if I had to be a prophet. Same thing that happened with Biden, right? He wound down Afghanistan finally. And before, the smoke had cleared, we're in a gigantic new Cold War. So there's some mechanism at work here that we have to be independent of party politics on this kind of core value thing, and say what Trump did here was right, what he did here was wrong. You could say what he did with Zelensky in the room was wrong because of its behavior, but that's maybe just a healthy reminder that he's Donald Trump and not our leader. but on the other hand, he said a lot of truth in that room. This could have led to World War III. This could have, this was provoked. Somebody had to say that finally, just like somebody had to finally admit that Afghanistan was a fiasco, or Vietnam in its day was a fiasco. But the problem is that people admit that, and we judge them by their party affiliation. And then they start another war, and we judge that war by their party affiliation. And that's, we can see Rubio is already sending more arms to Israel. So, this mechanism is fully in play under Trump as it was under Biden. It's just that I think we all need to learn to judge these things as critical thinkers and not as members of one party or the other. Does that help?
Okay, thanks, Harris. That was great. Let's go to Louise Coleman.
Hi. Okay.
Yeah.
What I was thinking about was going right along with what you were just talking about. It does seem like it's sort of a salvage operation with people like Biden and all of the other Democrats that you outlined. They had so much that was positive, but it got the toxic part overwhelmed. So I'm just trying to figure out, can you think of a way or a mechanism or how to how to like make things different. I mean, it's like it just seems as though this goes on and on and on and on and on. So do you understand what I mean? It's just like there's not a um
Well, I've been hinting throughout this talk, and then to my answer to the question, there is a mechanism at work. I would call the mechanism by its real name, which is the iron law of capital, which is rate of return has to be higher than growth for the investor class, and it's very difficult to maintain that without the arms industry. This is why we get into the spine, because we haven't created a just society. Well, we've created a society that redistributes injustice back into something more just. And by that, I mean the welfare state. You tax millionaires and you put the money into Medicaid. Well, that's a very good thing, but you still have to have the millionaires. You have to make sure they're doing better in order for you to be able to tax them at those rates. And that's, the struggle clearly is the Republicans think we don't even need that. Yeah, I mean, they want the Hobbesian worldview. Forget it. That's the whole thing. But either way, they need that. They need that revenue, and they won't have that revenue if there isn't a strong base for the rate of return. And energy and arms are two of the greatest industries for generating a rate of return that's real. It's not just hedge funds and stuff like that. But I mean, real production. Those are still the two big engines, and we have to get away from those as the two big engines, or we will destroy the planet one way or the other.
Right. So what I just keep trying to think of like how to point that out to people, how to get that message across. I mean, it's hard to like be succinct and just get it out there so people understand.
Well, I think the care economy is a linchpin in that. I really think if you talk about the care economy, child care and healthcare, we all will need care sometime in our life. It's something that unites us as a species, that we need care. We need care when we're born. We need it before we die. We often need it over our whole lives in one form or another. And that care economy is also the source of truly green jobs. Most care workers don't use any fossil fuels or any fuels at all. They use their human energy, their human sensitivity, their physical capabilities to take care of people. And so I'm really talking about those levels that we represent: home care workers, child care workers, group home workers. These people are true green jobs. When you invest in them, you are not investing in destroying the climate or the environment. And on the military front, when you invest in them, that money comes out of the military. It really does, because you only have those two big choices: the care or the military with the income tax. If you put it into the care, you're not putting it into the military. If you put it in the military, you're not putting it in the care. So the care economy becomes the convergence of the environmental movement, the peace movement, and the movement for justice.
Okay, thanks, Harris. Thank you, Louise. Let's go to Anatol Zuckerman.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we're all set, Anatol.
Yes, Mr. Gorman, thank you for your excellent presentation, so concise and so clear. I have a question about President Trump. He's been talking about like the peacemaker for many years, and his latest cooperation with Putin, as he promised, is to reduce reduce the new Cold War. Don't you think it's his empty words, or do you think it's actually going to come to something tangible?
Well, I mean, I'm hoping, certainly if you had asked me 2 years ago, what is the most necessary thing? I would say the most necessary thing is that the United States and Russia and the United States and China learn to collaborate again, learn to work together again. Otherwise, the world is in serious danger, both to nuclear war and to environmental collapse. And Trump is not good on the environment, so that may not be addressed very well. But Putin and Xi may not be great on the environment either. But the thing is, reality often, if people are talking, maybe reality takes hold. I mean, there certainly have been initiatives where the United States has worked with unusual suspects to do good things. So I'm hopeful about that side of things. I don't see the Middle East going that way.
No.
So it's a possibility that we're going to do some kind of shift. I don't know. I'm not going to go so far as to say there's a penchant for the Democrats to want to wage war on Russia and the Republicans to want to wage war in the Middle East. That does seem to be a more recent pattern. But even Clinton and Obama, got involved in Middle Eastern fiascos.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I think we should try to be hopeful, but I do think we're dealing with a somewhat unstable worldview there, and I don't know what to make of it. But I have to say at Riyadh, when Marco Rubio was talking to Lavrov about how to have relations again, that was a very good thing. Whether good things come from it, we'll have to see. But that was so needed. And I know it enrages Democrats and Europeans and all kinds of people, but that's the only way to save the planet and the human
But
rights.
it's amazing thing that if China and Russia will start cooperation with the United States, that will reconstruct the entire political structure of the world. That there will be they may stop the war between East and West. I mean, it's hard to imagine the biggest thing than that.
Well, it's sort of like when Nixon went to China. Nobody thought that was going to happen. He was the most ardent anti-communist in the world. And yet, that did change our relationship to China such that, in a certain sense, it's odd that we're in a bellicose relationship with China now because, 20 years ago, the Ferguson over in England said, oh, China and the United States are one political economy. It's just that the United States are the Eloi and the Chinese are the Morlocks. That was a reference to H.G. Wells' Time Machine. But he meant that, it was symbiotic at the very least. And, there has even been whispering about the United States joining BRICS. So maybe we're on the verge of some kind of epochal shift in geopolitics. I don't know. Let's just hope it's a more peaceful one.
Yeah, a lot of things in play. Thank you, Anatol. Let's go. We have 2 more questions left. That okay, Harris?
Sure.
Yeah, so let's take Jeffrey Bachtel. Jeffrey?
Still muted, Jeffrey.
Loved your presentation. I loved your presentation, and I would like to be in touch with you for starters. But my question is, I got two actually. The remainings are in the chat if you want to take a look. At least Trump is not a master of manipulation, deception, political acumen, and good at exploiting a crisis like Palpatine was during the prequel trilogy of Star Wars, right? That's my first question. And secondly, this reminds me of the national budget thing, that they show how much money goes into where, more to the military than anything else. So why not? I'm gonna come up with a plan. Why not just have it everything equally balanced? I even did a mathematical calculation on that to show. If you want to see, I can show you right now.
We don't have time for that now, Jeffrey, but
I think that's. Yeah, look, anything would be a step forward. It's not that we could. I wouldn't even recommend that we just not have a military anymore, even though that would be a utopian dream. But I do think that we need to bring things into balance, as you say, and that in itself would shift resources greatly over to human needs.
Yeah, I agree. Do you want? I got ideas that can help. That can what's the saying? Knock your socks off or something like that. So would you like to stay in touch with me? So I can.
I'll put my email in the chat for you.
No,
Yeah, you
because
you can follow up there,
I re
Jeffrey. Thanks for your question. Let's take,
what Paul,
and
a personal
yes, Jeffrey. Oops, I'm sorry, maybe I cut him off too soon. But we do have to get to a question by John Lawrence.
it's just a personal request I have.
Okay, just put that in the chat then too, Jeffrey. We have to move on here, okay? So, John, can you ask your question?
Yes, I was wondering if you've ever seen like a progressive plan for, basically for how to implement the United States giving up global hegemony. Like, if we gave up our military supremacy, it likely means giving up our diplomatic and economic supremacy and basically reorganizing the world. It's unlikely that capital would still recycle their money through New York City if we weren't the global military hegemon. So, have you ever seen a plan for if it seems like we need to have like a plan ready, like things can change quickly, like how would we reorganize the world if we ever did get power, type of thing.
Well, I mean, I think it's happening de facto. I mean, in other words, the United States is losing its hegemony. I mean, a lot of these wars seem to get more and more desperate each time. They have less and less positive outcome for our hegemony. Look at what's happening now. During the Ukraine war, I think Biden and company were very confident that would actually shore up the alliance with Europe, and and the rest of the world would fall in line with sanctions, and that we would be the people driving things like we were after the end of the Cold War. We felt that way, unipolar power, and it didn't work out that way. I mean, the war has been a stalemate. The Russian economy has not collapsed from sanctions. The Europeans actually have been collapsing instead. I mean, the more they sided with us, I mean, Macron's government fell, Schulz's government fell. It is, I mean, in Sunak's before in England fell. Now maybe Starmer's will fall. I mean, they're not benefiting from hegemony. They're actually losing control of their own political economies. And so, and I think the same's happening in the United States. This Trump thing, in some ways, is a sign of incredible, confusion and chaos within the country. And I think that's forcing the situation. Can we get a grip on it as progressives, or as a nation, to say, how can we live in a multipolar world and it's actually a more peaceful world, a more cooperative world? I mean, I always go back to Schroeder and Putin standing together in Kaliningrad or Königsberg, where Kant was born, very symbolic place, and saying back in 2008, saying we envision a zone of economic and societal cooperation from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Now, I have to tell you, that set off the United States, because that was like, whoa, that's not us. I mean, we might be part of that. We might be interacting with it, but that's too much power outside of our control. And, one of the reasons why we pushed through the expansion of NATO into Ukraine and Georgia that same year, 2008, that's when we approved that and forced the Europeans to agree to it. And, I think that, what we have to do is find a way to actually embrace images like that and use them to the advantage of everybody. And that means if we don't like Putin particularly, or we don't like Xi particularly, or we don't like Trump particularly, or we don't like Netanyahu particularly, that's a project of political organizing and political change, but not war. War does not lead to that kind of change. It leads usually to something more out of control and worse. I don't know if that helps, but it is a hard. I mean, that's sort of like the World Federalist League or so. I mean, it's hard to imagine how we get there, but I think the image is there. We thought we were sort of going there at the end of the Cold War, and I think a terrible mistake we made in the United States is we did not push hard to end NATO at that point. NATO should have been obsolete at the end of the Cold War, and instead it carried on subterraneanly. And now has reemerged as an incredible force for trying to be a force for world domination, which it's failing at. So.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, the United States has been dependent on military Keynesianism for 70 years, and then politically to organize, we need to be able to talk about a transition plan to something different.
Yeah, well, the same place we were at the end of World War II. You know, that was a moment. You know, I like to say, you know, a friend of mine, I don't know if he's on this call or not. He signed up, Cliff Harris. I'll give him credit. He said 1946, a revolutionary year, and I really believe that was when the CIO did, you know, the Union, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, did Operation Dixie to try and organize the South in an interracial way, and you know, we had Henry Wallace, you know, had been the vice president and was still a strong voice for peace and for justice. C. Wright Mills was writing about, you know, we got to choose between a total war economy and a human economy. And that's one of the great tragedies is 1947 and 48 was the counter-revolution.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Harris. Let me just we're pretty much out of time, but I just wanted to raise one issue. I mean, I want to ask you whether this issue of party politics dominating what positions people take, as opposed to the principles at stake, whether that situation is getting worse. You know, when we're back in the 80s, you know, when Reagan was in power, you had Democrats organizing trips to the Soviet Union, the evil empire, and trying to establish contacts and supporting new relations with the Soviet Union to get nuclear weapons agreements and the friendship between countries, even sister cities, I believe, a few back in that time. And yet when Trump tries to normalize relations with Russia, you get all hell breaking loose from the Democrats, you know, because of the identity of Democrats with the hatred of Russia that the Democrats have been pushing ever since, at least since Hillary Clinton. And so I'm just wondering whether you think this situation of party politics impacting what people, the attitudes people take on issues of war and peace has gotten worse over the years.
Well, it certainly reached a low point in my lifetime in the second year and third year of the Biden administration, where people were simply all gung-ho for these wars, and they were derailing exactly why they supported Democrats because of, you know, the care agenda and the environmental agenda. Both of those were derailed by this push for war. And I think, you know, like I said, there was a kind of one area of pushback was the Gaza, because that was such a moral outrage, you know, that it's kind of hard to avoid confronting it in a moral way. But every other aspect of it was basically let slide. And you know, I think there was a better period after Vietnam. You know, Vietnam was a real watershed because finally the Cold War consensus on war and the necessity of war broke for a while. You know, the post-Vietnam period was a period where you did have a, you know, like the sort of George McGovern, you know, Eugene McCarthy kind of world of Democrats who actually were anti-war. But and that's why Carter, you know, is maybe a high point in that, even though it was very disappointing too. See, that's the problem when you look closely at what Carter did in foreign policy, or what Obama did in foreign policy, or Clinton did in foreign policy. There's a lot to be ashamed of, and a lot to see a continuity with the Cold War and with the Republicans' bellicosity. And I think that that has been a consistent thing. But I do think the attitudes had to change for a while. The peace movement was at the heart of the Democratic Party in a different kind of way in the 70s and 80s than it's been, you know, certainly since the war on terror, you know, where once the Democrats inherited the war on terror, they stopped being peace leaders, you know, very peculiar. And then with Biden, it's like for me, it's a amazing repetition of the Truman Doctrine, you know, amazing repetition of the counter-revolution of 1947-48, where you have Democrats actually leading the way on both, and that's Freeland's point, leading the way on both war and internal suppression of dissent. Because one thing I will say is when you resisted the Ukraine war, you were really put in a bad light by people who should have at least been willing to have a dialogue. And that felt a lot like a kind of McCarthyism. And both the Republicans and the Democrats, when McCarthyism becomes the norm, they both play that game. You know, they played it with protesters about Gaza. They played it with the crucial communism teaching bill that was passed by bipartisan majority in December 5th of last year. I mean, it's a very dangerous phenomenon that has been repeated. And so I think we were lulled by the kind of the theater of the counterculture and the peace movement after Vietnam into thinking we had turned a corner. I thought we had turned a corner.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's great. Thanks, Harris. Cole Harrison, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. So Harris, I go along with a lot of your analysis, but there's something missing for me. When Bernie Sanders leads the charge and Jim McGovern to aid Ukraine, which they really have been the leaders of in many ways, it isn't entirely Biden. It's actually the more progressive, relatively anti-war, so quote unquote, section of the Democratic Party that has been leading for the war in Ukraine. Why is that? I don't think it's just because of the millionaires and the Medicaid thing. I think there's an ideological commitment to what they consider, a democratic world order that the United States must steward. And I think that 20 or 30 years ago, these people thought that we could maintain that order without such a large military, and they were willing to scale it back and try this multilateralism. But now they see everything collapsing around them, and they feel we've got to draw the line against the terrible Putin and the terrible Xi Jinping. So I predict that even the so-called progressive and pro-Medicaid Democrats are being sucked into the defense of this empire because they can't see past the ideology. What do you think of that?
Well, I hope that's not missing from my account. I mean, I would agree with everything you said because, that's my point in a way is party politics. It isn't Biden like as an individual. It's that the party, we're protecting their own and they have a worldview to do it. I really like the way you brought that out. I mean, that's very important because that takes us back to something we often forget. I mean, like I was mentioned, Richard Freeland, who wrote that book on the Truman Doctrine. I mean, he and I talked about this. We forget that it was easy for Truman to create a boogeyman, a kind of new Hitler out of Stalin, and that numbers of very progressive people, could look at the facts and actually say, yeah, I don't like him. I don't like what he's doing. He's a murderer. He's we don't have to adjudicate that. But the problem was, Roosevelt knew that too. And Roosevelt said, I will find a way to work with Stalin because the world's survival depends on our cooperation. And I will, and in fact, Frank Worth, who was the British reporter in Russia during the war and at the end of the war, said when Roosevelt died, everyone in Russia was out in the streets weeping and wailing. And he asked them, well, what's the problem? Why are you so upset? Because he spoke Russian very fluent. He was a son of a Russian emigre even. And they all said, Roosevelt knew how to deal with Stalin. We could have had peace. No one else will be able to do it. Churchill can't do it, and this new Truman can't do it. And then when he dropped the atomic bomb, they were really like, he's not going to do it. He's going to come after us. So, I think that we forget how that was. So what's been happening now is they've recreated a boogeyman in the image of the authority, instead of it being the communist dictator, because that seems very outdated, although the Republicans still play that with China. Bannon still calls it the Chinese Communist Party whenever he refers to China. But the Democrats prefer this new boogeyman, which is authoritarianism. So, over there is authoritarian, over here is democracy. And the perversity of that is the Saudi Arabians are over here with us. Netanyahu, whatever democratic system Israel still is, he's over here with us. Macron loses his election overwhelmingly to the left. Also to the right, but more to the left, and does not let them participate in the government at all. doesn't make any gesture toward them. In fact, even makes his first prime minister after those elections is a Le Pen supporter. So, you know, we talk about authoritarianism and democracy, and a lot of us who were anti-Cold War too said, well, we can be very big hypocrites about all this stuff. Still, they had an argument that you'd rather live in the United States than in Stalin's Russia. And most people would say, yeah, I guess so. And the same thing is true today. You would rather live in, you know, Macron's France than in Putin's Russia. I don't know, though, if anybody would prefer to have lived in Ukraine in the past 20 years, because that would look like Russia. I mean, it was run by, you know, oligarchs. It was, you know, it was the most corrupt nation in Europe before the war started, when Zelensky was president.
That's not what Bernie
Yeah.
thinks. That's not what
I know. I mean, I was just out in the street trying to scrape my Bernie bumper sticker off my car this afternoon. I mean, no. I mean, what you know what this is? I mean, this is. I mean, let's get
still need him on Medicaid. All right, I don't want to
let's
go
get back to 1914 and say, you know, the Germans. You say, "Wer hat uns verraten? Die Sozialdemokraten." That means who betrayed us? The Social Democrats, because they voted for the World War I war credits for 50 years, saying we will go on general strike rather than have a war. You know, so. I mean, these things happen over and over again. Again, you know, Bernie is being a party loyalist here. Robert Reich did the same thing the other day. You know, these are people I looked up to and, you know, voted for and stuff.
Yeah, it's a mess, and we probably should close it down for tonight. But of course, Bernie at least is offering the attempt to block the weapons to Gaza. So it's such a
No, in Israel they've fallen back into line, but not on Ukraine. You know,
no, not on the Cold War. That's for sure. So Harris, thank you so much. And I think people can see from this discussion that we should have Harris back sometime to talk about, give his insights about how we should deal with this Trump administration. What our strategy should be, given the fact that on some things he's called for possible new nuclear weapons negotiations and all this type of stuff. These are the things that the Democrats, that's the last thing on earth they want to do. And it's a real confusing situation. Overall, Trump's policies are just so disastrous for the country and the world. But how do we work our way through this confusing situation that we're faced with right now? And
Can I just say one last thing?
Organize ourselves effectively. Well, let's.
I just want to say one fast thing.
30 seconds, Louise. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, one thing that people don't talk about enough at all is that Donald Trump has the nuclear codes. I mean, it's not like we have this infinite amount of time to, you know, work on everything. I mean, it's like it's a really urgent situation. That's all I'm going to say.
Of course, Biden had the nuclear codes.
Well,
too.
no, but it's like Trump is like Trump.
Well.
All right, we'll talk about it, Paul.
Yeah, these are issues of importance.
They certainly are.
Biden is the one who nearly brought us to nuclear war.
Okay, well,
long range
this keeps going on and on.
Tough
on and on and on. Harris, I think we better let you go, otherwise we're going to hold you all night. Thanks very much, Harris, and thanks everyone for tuning into this. And you'll be getting an email with a link to the recording of this program if you think it's important for your friends and other associates to see it. Okay, so keep an eye out for that email. You'll get as a follow-up, and we've got all kinds of good programs coming up too. Harris, thanks a million.
Okay, thank you.
So very good.